Report obtained under the Freedom of Information Act shows America has been simulating an invasion of West Africa following an imaginary terror attack in New York. RT's Polly Boyko explains.
This fictional scenario begins in May 2023. There's been a devastating terror attack in New York. Terrorists detonate truck bombs at either end of the Lincoln Tunnel. They kill and injure hundreds of Americans. And just like 9/11 led to the war on terror in the Middle East, this fictional attack leads to the deployment of US and Canadian troops in Africa. They're fighting African al-Qaeda militants. And the president promises it'll take just 3 years, according to this fictional script. But 2 years into the war, and things aren't going well. There is a 90% increase in violence in Mauritania and Mali, where the war has quietly spread to as well. And that's despite the fact that there's 70,000 US and Canadian troops in the region. Now, 3 years later, just as the troops are meant to be pulling out, according to the president's timeline, the war game throws another painfully familiar spanner into the works, and that is a fictional general sending a fictional communique saying that he recommends delaying pulling out the troops by 1 year at least. In fact, he recommends sending more troops to the region in order to avoid the mission failing entirely. So the word quagmire certainly springs to mind. It is all pretty reminiscent of the US's other real forays abroad, for example, in Afghanistan. But the whole point of this war game is to help prime the future generals of the US. It was being simulated in the most elite military training academies across the US. And it's interesting that the action plays out on the African continent. Bear in mind, there are already 1,500 US troops in Africa already. Is this all a Freudian slip about where the Pentagon thinks the war on terror is going to shift to next? And does it show the Pentagon's stark realism about the way that US military conflicts tend to pan out?
Well, intriguing stuff. And to discuss this further, let's now bring in Jan Oberg, Director of the Transnational Foundation for Peace and Future Research. Jan, thank you very much indeed for joining me. Well, it's, as I said, intriguing stuff. I mean, do you have any issues with the US simulating a New York terror attack to invade Africa?
No, I mean, first of all, this is a kind of war game, and those are happening. This is not the only one. I mean, it happens generally. People are thinking about what will the future be. What is really interesting is that it ends with, you know, getting stuck in Africa too, like everywhere else, with all these failed wars by the US. Secondly, it's very interesting that the African experience has to do with the fact that Libya was smashed up, and that's where we have a lot of the generation of new terrorism and training of new terrorists in that part of the world. Third, it's very indicative and revealing that after 16 years of fighting terrorism, the global war on terror, there's not one person in the United States who obviously are beginning to think, have we done things wrong the last 16 years? Because statistics tell you that the global terror problem costs 80 times, I said not percent, but times more human lives today than it did in the year 2000. So the main creator today of terrorism is the war on terror. It's not terrorists, it's the war on terror that provokes it. And so what this war game illustrates is that the only answer the American military and political people have is tit for tat, violence against violence, and this is an unending. We're never going to have solve the problem of terrorism by killing terrorists. It's as stupid as it would be to say we want to eradicate all diseases by killing all patients. This is such a low intellectual level that the world ought to, and Europeans and others who might still be able to think constructively, would ask the Americans to think differently about this type of warfare.
And it's also pretty specific as well in how they describe it as well. I mean, do you think also it's a coincidence that you've got a simulation comes as the US AFRICOM? They created that in 2008. They're ramping up operations across the continent. Do you think that's a coincidence?
No, it's not a coincidence. Of course, the more you are globally present, and the Americans have military base facilities in about 130 countries. Of these 130 countries, whatever happens there will be seen as a national threat to the US. And so, you know, if you go somewhere, you get resistance. The best would be to pull out or not go in there. The best would have been not to start the Iraq war. The best would have been not to destroy Libya. The best would have been not to do secret operations for 5-6 years in Syria. The best would have been to talk with people. You know, if you're really strong and the only, let's say, dimension of power that you have is a hammer, all problems in the world will be seen as something that will be solved by means of hammers. And at the end, instead of, you know, using other tools, you're ending up smashing one country after the other and getting hated. And that is, to summarize it all, examples of this game too, of the decreasing or tendency to fall of the US empire. That's unfortunately a very dangerous period we have to go through the next 5 to 10 years. Not the United States in dissolution, but the US empire must go before it can become a better world.
And on that point, we'll leave it. Jan Oberg, Director of the Transnational Foundation for Peace and Future Research. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.